really a treat to be here. I have a lot of stories to tell about this incredible neighborhood I fell in love with in 1981. So this is Liberty's People, Red Hook in the 80s. I'm gonna begin at the beginning. In kindergarten, my teacher read a book about dinosaurs, and I grasped the concept of extinction and death. Suddenly, I wanted to know everything about the world. My sister, who played school teacher with all the neighborhood kids, taught me to read. But elementary school was all downhill after that. With 50 kids in my first grade class and one teacher, I learned how to line up, how to fold my hands, and how to keep my mouth shut. Mm-hmm. I rode the early school bus, and I had to attend mass at the enormous empty church every day. Girls sat to the left of the main aisle and boys to the right. To entertain myself, I studied the pictures in the colorful stained glass windows and mournful statues, and every night I prayed that I would die a saint. The sooner the better. When I was 12, my older brother said, "I'm so sick of my pious little sister. Don't you know God didn't write the Bible? Humans wrote it." And for the second time in my life, I woke up and I said, "Then I'll be a writer." A few years later, when I told my mother, she contacted a college friend, Marguerite, who had a PhD in English literature, and Marguerite agreed to tutor me as a way of paying off a debt she owed my mother. We met regularly to discuss poetry and the Western literary canon. I graduated early from high school and flew to New York City and met my father's cousin Martha, a modern dancer living in Westbeth, one of the first artist buildings in the city. For 2 weeks, I watched her dance troupe rehearse as the icebergs floated down the Hudson. "One day I will live in New York," I told her. "Liberty will be my neighbor. I will call the Brooklyn Bridge home." So, 7 years later, when my boyfriend, Paul Glavinsky, was accepted to graduate school in New York City, I made the leap and moved with him. Listening to folk music in Manhattan's Eagle Tavern on 14th Street in 1981, we ran into one of his college counselors, Richard Dutton, who told us he bought a house in Red Hook for $7,500 and invited us to stop by. I was smitten with Richard's small, tidy house without modern amenities. It looked to me like William Blake might have lived there. The streets were paved in Dutch radiating cobblestones. Liberty stood at the end of the street, so close I felt I could touch her. The smell of coffee beans stored in the Civil War warehouses wafted in the salt air. Great thick vines of purple wisteria grew up the side of brick homes. I heard taps from Governor's Island. Stories seemed to float in with the tide. I want to read you a little poem from this book that was published, a collection of poems published just down the street on Van Brunt. Red Hook Poems, June Crane of Chroma Press, who's here. Want to raise your hand, June? Published them. And Gregory Crane, sitting next to her, did this beautiful drawing of, it's probably right here. It's called The End of the Road. The End of the Roads. I think it's Roads. Anyway, the poem I want to read is Liberty. It's called Liberty. And so Liberty. I forgot to say the last long letter. You are a beautiful woman. Your eyes catch like sticks rubbed together. Bonfire lights your sculpture. Such a welcoming you are to the new world. We warm ourselves at your side, and all that is buried rises. Birds and snakes fly from my hair. I've got a home, acres between my shoulders, Adam and Eve, and wild grasses and water. So, Richard Dutton introduced us to Jerry Lombardo, a retired longshoreman whose wife wanted to move out of Red Hook, and he was bent on saving the neighborhood by bringing in artists. He grew fruit trees and planted them in empty lots and backyards. He scavenged the dumpsters for things people might need. And he knocked on doors until he found someone willing to sell us a wood-framed 3-story house leaning against the apartment building next door. The owner wanted $6,000 cash. The neighborhood had fallen apart in the 1970s. The Port Authority of New York and New Jersey condemned entire blocks of Red Hook when it needed to expand for containerization. But the shipping industry ended up moving to New Jersey. Butcher shops, barber shops, bakeries, groceries, pharmacies, ice cream stores, and the high school all closed as many old-timers moved away. Word on the street was that landlords set their buildings on fire for insurance settlements. Many blocks looked toothless like ours, with only 2 intact buildings. A beautiful big brick wreck stood next door to us, but somebody regularly threw garbage into it. Every time we contacted them to buy it, he upped the price. Eventually, the city tore it down and it became a parking lot for school buses. Diane O'Donnell, another newcomer, got off the B61 bus one night to find Pops leaning over a dead man in an empty lot wearing a tuxedo. Another night, peeking through a basement window to see what all the noise was about, she saw a cockfight, men holding roosters in their arms and dollars in their fists. I appreciated the stories. I fell in love with this colorful neighborhood over and over, like the kids with bowling balls and pins from the dumpster playing in the street, or the girls who jumped rope naming the cross streets of Red Hook in a song handed down over the decades. King Sullivan told Wolcott to tell Dykeman to spill coffee all over Van Dyke's beard. Our neighbors and the handful of newcomers renovating houses became our community, with the Statue of Liberty as the patron saint. Red Hook made living in New York City affordable. We could make art, raise a family, and park our car for free. My friend Janet Newhouser, who started a restaurant with me out west during our college years, bought a brick house a block away and enrolled in MFA photography program at Pratt. Olga Bloom, founder of Barge Music under the Brooklyn Bridge, brought her violin student, Al Frank, to the neighborhood, and he taught us how to rip walls, hang sheetrock, and helped us install a wood stove in our kitchen. Naz Hosseini, a singer and dancer with Meredith Monk, started Red Hook Arts for PS15 elementary school students. I took a leave of absence from my part-time publishing job to work one summer as a program director. For 6 weeks, I watched a rowdy group of kids in the sweltering summer heat learn a dance routine in complete silence as they followed their deaf teaching artists' every move. It was beautiful. To give you a feeling of a hot summer night in Red Hook, I'm going to read a story called The G-Man's Daughter from this collection that Jan and I published in 2008. Her photographs, Jan, raise your hand. Her photographs of the neighborhood and my stories. So I'm just gonna sit down for a minute and read this. The G-Man's Daughter. It was to the cab of a semi parked in a lot on Wolcott Street that Luann headed at 2 in the morning, just a block and a half from her parents' house. Her newly bleached hair was as stark as a flag against the desolate neighborhood. Not only did she have a large purple bruise on her cheekbone, the entire surface of her round face glistened with her mother's makeup. Strutting along in a short, sleeveless dress, her whiteness altogether waved in the night. "Julia," she called as she neared the blue cab of a truck. She threw a rock at it and smashed the front headlight. A handsome, bare-chested, dark-skinned boy with black, straight hair appeared in the passenger window. "Girls can't throw for nothing," he laughed. The door clicked open, and he took both of her hands and briskly pulled her 6 feet straight up. It was a bullseye, she said. She slipped off her plastic shoes and snuggled down in his lap, and they began where they left off 3 days before, curled up outside behind the bodega. After a long, motionless kiss, they climbed into the bunk behind them. Luann slapped a foiled packet into Julio's hand. "You're acting like you got experience, and I know you ain't," he said, smiling for the first time. "A man can tell. You're hot, girl. You're hot like my big lighter." "My girlfriend Lena had a baby, and her aunt in Puerto Rico's raising her," Luann said. She undid the row of buttons down the front of her dress. "And I promised my girlfriend Desiree I wouldn't get pregnant because Lena changed a lot, and her mood isn't the same anymore. Besides, my Uncle Ricky has AIDS. I don't want AIDS. I don't want a baby neither. So that's how I was conceived, in the back of my father's car. So put that on or I'm getting out." Julio slipped off his shorts and turned away, all the time eyeing her sliver of belly as she pulled her dress over her head. She wadded it into a ball and tossed it into the driver's seat, adjusted her panties and laid back in the musty blanket that covered the mattress. She folded her hands at her waist and stared at the rusted metal roof, waiting. "You're beautiful," he whispered, kissing her foot. Luann bucked with screams and laughter, her fair legs cutting into the streetlight, which shined down upon them through the dirty windshield. "Now, do like I said," she scolded. "Don't spoil it for me. I'm looking forward to it 15 years. "I got it, man. Take a look." Julio threw the wrapper out the window and climbed on top of her. He wiggled around, kissing her neck and breasts, while Luann held him tight, focusing on the only star out the driver's window. Then he came down with short plunges, and she was thinking she might burst open. She heard that something must be wrong, and the star moved toward her. She saw its red wing lights as it screeched overhead. By the time the noise of the jet had subsided, Julio was back in the passenger seat with his shorts on, swigging from a pint of milk. She watched him pull on a pair of ragged cutoffs. "That's it," she said. "Tomorrow's another day, ain't it, unless your old man catches ass." Relieved, Luann giggled and rolled onto her side. She propped her head in her hand. "My father was passed out on the couch when I left, and my mother's staying at my grandmother's in the projects. They ain't been getting along. I sleep in my brother's room because they got a lock on the door. Not that we're scared, we just don't want him bothering us when he's drunk. But he usually ain't like that. Grandma said he was jealous when he saw your arm around me last weekend. That's why he yelled at you." Julio tossed her wadded up dress to her. "Who beat you?" Luann sat up. She lightly touched her sore cheek. "That was Candy. I broke her front tooth." "You fight like a cat." Parting her shoulder-length hair, Luann showed him the bald spot. "See what Candy done? She called me a dyke, and I slapped her face, and she pulled my hair, and I bit her good on the arm, and there was a lot of blood, and I was suspended from school, but my mother is the PTA president, and she got me back enrolled. Then Candy told her brother Jack that the dog don't go into the living room where I babysit, and he robbed their stereo, and I lost my babysitting job. So yesterday I took Desiree and the kids on my block to Candy's house, and they waited in the street while I went upstairs and punched her in the mouth." "You two white girls are too much the same," said Julio. He handed her the half-empty carton of milk. "But you're better, Lou. You got the body of Marilyn Monroe." She grabbed the rearview mirror, checking out her dress, her hair, her bruised cheek, and after admiring her smile, kissed the dusty mirror and left it with a breathy pink smudge. "Let's go, babe," he said. Throwing open the door, Julio started out into the darkness across the dirt parking lot, still hot from the afternoon sun. At the corner, he pushed his hair to the side and lit a cigarette. Finally, Luann jumped down from the cab. She landed with her hands on the ground and wobbled over to him. "You walk like your foot broke." "My shoe broke." Luann kicked off both shoes. She stuck them in her neighbor's overflowing garbage can and took hold of Julio around the waist. He swooped her up in his arms, their mouths locked. He carried her that way down the broken sidewalk with his eyes wide open, flitting nervously as he neared her house. "I'm bigger than you," Luann said, coming up for air. "Oh, you ain't. How much do you weigh?" "It don't matter, my size is in my limbs," Julio spouted. "And I'm still growing. I'm gonna be a world champ ball player. You gonna be big like your mama?" "No, my father don't like it." A coolness she hadn't felt all summer ran through her when her feet hit the ground. Her father was slumped over the front stoop, sleeping. "Yo," Julio said, already skipping backwards. "Tomorrow, same time, same place." She motioned for him to go. "Thanks, Julie, you did me a favor." When Julio rounded the corner, she tiptoed up the front steps, feeling proud of what she'd done. But seeing her father close up, she wavered, his balding head resting against the cast iron railing. The few long strands of hair from the back of his head hung over his eyes, lost in wrinkles. His hands were held as if in prayer, tucked between the knees of his blue jeans, thumbs crossed. For a second, one eye opened and he lifted his head. His temple had a deep flower-like impression from the ornate railing. "Hi, Lulu," he said. He motioned for her to sit down. "Elsie across the street's got a boyfriend over there in the red pickup. They've been kissing goodnight for half an hour now. Good somebody's in love. Maybe my next wife should be an artist." "Daddy, don't say that." His mumbling stopped and his eyes slumped shut. Luann hadn't sat close to her father since she was a toddler on his knee. She glanced across Van Brunt Street toward Elsie's when her father's eyes popped open again, red as beets. "Me and your mom is having problems, Lou. I'd leave, but I know I'd get trapped again. I got 2 bad marriages and 4 views from each." "You say it like we trapped you. I didn't have anything to do with it." "Well, I am going to do, what am I going to do when my body's too broke to do the route?" He threw up his hands. "I can't work behind a desk. I even tried driving a bus. I'm a G-man, 8 kids, 2 wives, and the Department of Sanitation is killing me." "You'd feel better if you got some sleep, Daddy." "Nah, I'm going to work soon. Would you please make me a cup of instant coffee, honey?" Luann dutifully went inside and set the water to boil. The brightly lit kitchen made her blink and rub her eyes. But she got out a mug from her father, added 3 lumps of sugar and 2 teaspoons full of instant coffee, and took the last Coke out of the refrigerator for herself. The empty fridge brought back her mother's absence. Luann sat down in her mother's worn chair and stared at the white spackling patterns on the wall, sipping from the bubbly can. Her mother told her all about sex when they were tanning at the Red Hook pool last summer, how awful it was being married to her father, and in which drawer the condoms were kept. When the kettle whistled, Luann poured boiling water into her father's cup. She was dying to tell her mother about Julio. "Mommy called this afternoon to say Mr. Kitty needs his worm pills," Luann said to her father as he took the hot cup. "And she's not coming home until the kitchen's painted. She says she's fed up with looking at the sheetrock and spackle." "Fed up," he laughed. "Shit, if your mother didn't eat so goddamn much, that wall wouldn't bother her. You can tell her that next time she comes home. I'm tired when I come home from work." She said she's sorry she misses us, but it's the only way to get things done. "Get things done," he said. "What's the use of trying?" Luann was suddenly sticky and uncomfortable, sitting with her father after the landmark evening, the shock of Julio crashing down overhead, and the feeling that she might disintegrate into the bunk of the cab. Yet for the first time she was free, her own person. She stood up to go. As she kissed her father goodnight, he noticed the twisted, wet ruffles of her dress tucked behind her. "You're bleeding, Luann." He set his coffee cup down and stood. "Honey, what happened? Are you hurt? Where were you out so late?" "Daddy, stop it," she cried as she tore at her dress. He picked her up, and looking for a knife wound or worse, he flipped her over his head on his fingertips like he did to the heavy trash cans. Cursing himself, he saw that it wasn't her underwear. He saw that it was her underwear, that this was his grown daughter, and he gently sat her back down on the stoop and put his head in his hands. "I'm sorry, Lou, you should have told me. I'm not menstruating, Dad," she said, jumping up to run into the house. "I'm no longer a virgin and I'm glad." "What? Just now to that dog?" Luann smiled. He said I was beautiful like Marilyn Monroe. Her father dropped to the step. "Don't be an idiot, Lou, that's a line. You're still a kid. Sex is dangerous." "Mommy was only a year and a half older than me, and you were married with 4 kids when she got pregnant. I took precautions. I'm not making your mistakes. Besides, I had to. Candy told everyone I was a dyke because of me and Desiree." "You and Desiree what?" "When we was little, we used to practice sex together." "Oh, for God's sake, Luann, you punched Candy's teeth out yesterday. Isn't that enough?" He pulled her down next to him. "Please, for my sake, you're my only girl, Lou. Be good. If you're grown up, okay. There's no going back. But now you've got to act like a lady, Luann. No more fighting. Forget about Candy. There ain't no winning her. Don't you see? Next it will be your teeth, and that'll come out of my pocket. Look, do me a favor. Save me a heart attack." "What about Mommy? You don't act grown up fighting with her all the time." "If you promise me that you'll have nothing to do with Candy, I'll paint the kitchen." "When?" "When I get home from work." Luann eyed him. "Today," he said. Luann leaned on her knees, her chin in her hands. The red pickup was gone now. She followed the outline of the roofs down the cobblestone streets to her shoes stuck in the garbage, which in a few hours her father would empty into the truck. Her favorite dress was gone now too, to rags like Cinderella's after the ball. "Promise?" The G-man reached for his daughter's arm and shook it impatiently. When she had stalled as long as possible, she agreed. He kissed her forehead. "And one more thing, honey," he smiled, smelling of both beer and coffee. "Promise me no more sneaking out at night. It's dangerous." "All right. What do you want? If you want to go out on a date or go to the movies or a party, okay, but don't go sleeping with every dick. Promise?" "Okay. And stay away from Julio. He's been hanging around here like a stray dog. He's probably slept with Candy and every other blonde in Red Hook." "Leave him out of this. He did me a favor." "No, that's not a favor," said her father. He leaned on the rail and lit a cigarette. "And one more thing. Promise you won't hang out with Desiree." "She's my best friend." "Look, just promise you won't see her no more. Do it for me, Luann. You're my only girl. I don't want to have to worry." "About what? She doesn't knock my teeth out or get me sick with AIDS or pregnant." "Say it. Say you promise, Lou. For me, I'm your father. I love you." She looked up at him. He had taken a comb out of his pocket. The cigarette hung in the corner of his mouth as he slicked his hair back. Because the sky was already blue with dawn, she would say it. He would leave her alone. "All right. That girl," he said, descending the steps and rounding the corner. She tucked her dress between her legs. A truck speeding down Van Brunt shook the ground. Dogs barked, smoky cars started up, and the first 3 jets in the distance, pink and silver in the sunrise, banked toward LaGuardia Airport. So, over the decades that we lived in Red Hook, our 3 children were born. Our backyard had a side alley and an old horse stable. The soil was rich. We grew apple and peach trees and lots of tomatoes. In summer, the local firemen climbed to the top of a concrete wall next to our garden and called out, "I hear you have some red-hot tomatoes," and I'd hand over a bag. A playgroup was organized among the newcomers. I cut hair for neighbors for free. And when the Brooklyn New School opened in a rundown building near the Brooklyn Battery Tunnel, I taught writing to elementary school students one day a week. Our oldest son attended kindergarten there. Frances, our next door neighbor, shook her finger when the city offered to plant a tree in our sidewalk. She said, "A tree will bring drug dealers." But as our tree grew, she and her husband set their lounge chairs out on the sidewalk and enjoyed the breeze from the harbor. The squatter across the street rented out rooms to people he met on the subway, and late at night they crawled through a hole in the chain link fence and went around back to get in. According to Francis, he had the front door booby-trapped. All summer long, the teenage girls at the top floor across the street hung out the windows singing and dancing, looking up and down the street for boys with wheels. Putty, another retired longshoreman who lived on the second floor with his wife and 8 children, stopped by now and then to tell us how much he loved us and our babies, and how much he loved his wife, and the ceramic she made from a mold at the rectory after Sunday Mass. And there was Greg O'Connell, who bought and renovated Civil War warehouses and saved dozens of buildings from being torn down. Sonny's Bar, around since 1890, a bodega and a coffee shop on Van Brunt, somehow stayed in business. There weren't any ferries or big box stores in Red Hook back then, so many of us rode the B-61 to downtown Brooklyn to get to work in Manhattan. I'm going to read one more story, and this is called Liberty's Commotion, and it's about the Liberty Centennial Celebration in 1986. Sorry. Here. Okay. Orly Logan didn't need to start anything. For the moment, enough was happening in the vacant dockyards of Red Hook, Brooklyn. It was July 4th, 1986, and preparation for Liberty's centennial celebration were underway. He stood intent looking in the warm morning sun, a pudgy 22-year-old in a striped t-shirt and neatly pressed jeans, among the small neighborhood crowd, mostly kids on bicycles, who'd gathered to watch the long black limousines move slowly down the freshly asphalted street to a checkpoint at Wolcott Pier. Since being fired from the concrete factory, Orly had grown a fuzzy mustache that accentuated the fact that he never smiled and rarely opened his mouth. The mustache made him look sinister. More than a dozen uniformed cops guarded the checkpoint, the road access to the Coast Guard ship, taking VIPs to Governor's Island. Orly pushed closed until every 5 minutes or so, one of the cops told him to move back. Although he couldn't see anything through the tinted backseat windows, the driver's windows were rolled down, and he had so far heard one mention Bob Hope, another Frank Sinatra, and a third Francois Mitterrand. Aside from Reagan's guests, there were those who had paid $5,000 to watch the opening ceremonies, and busloads of kids dressed in band uniforms that were going to board the John F. Kennedy. At 11 o'clock, Orly wandered toward the neighborhood demonstration gathering at the Green Thumb Garden with their painted signs, but he didn't join them. He crossed his arms and scrutinized each limousine as it rolled by. Blonde-headed Jack the Thief came out of the corner store chewing a candy bar. Upon reaching Orly, he pulled out 2 bottles of pilfered beer from his jacket. They sauntered back down Wolcott, twisting off the tops. Jack tossed his fist overhead toward the Goodyear blimp, motoring dully. Orly leaned back against the chain-link fence of the Episcopal Church and drank. The grocery store owner, a young Arab from Atlantic Avenue, appeared at the corner, shaking his fist at Jack. "Piss off," Jack yelled, and he gave him the finger. I haven't seen so many cops since Rikers, forward every intersection. Don't want any big shots getting lost in the hook. And these choppers overhead, they have their eye out. They must be aware old Jack is out of the box. "Give us liberty, she's ours. We want front row seats," the demonstrators chanted. They were outnumbered by the escorting police, but they were able to slow the limo traffic as Jack and Orly headed back down Wolcott toward the piers. Some of the limos even drove off the specially paved lane to get around the demonstrators. Women and children and men wearing pajamas or undershirts hung from the windows of the only two houses on the block, both of which were decorated with little plastic American flags and cardboard pictures of the Statue of Liberty. Kazmak, the Civic Association president, headed the demonstrators. He carried the PS-15 assembly flag. His wife and children, all as blonde as he was, followed with hand-painted copper green puzzle pictures of Liberty's face. The wife carried the crown, eyes and forehead, mouth and chin, while the two youngest on either side of her each carried an ear and a cheek. Fishy, fishy, Jack called when he spotted Isabel in the crowd. He enjoyed entertaining the little boys on the curb as much as he liked bothering her. Fishy don't wear no underwear. Shut up, Isabel yelled back, stepping livelier, with more than a bounce to her curves. Jack knew she liked the attention. Isabel showed him her sign, give to the people, and linked arms with crazy Mr. Loomis, who jumped at her touch. Give to the guys, Jack shot back, throwing the beer bottle at her feet. Father Swan clicked his tongue at Jack. It was his church they stood in front of, and the slender figure dressed in black with telltale collar stopped the flow of limos as he bent to pick up the pieces, carefully placing the green glass in his white palm. Two officers, not much older than Jack, had saddled up to the priest and were talking quietly. Meanwhile, Orly slipped his beer into his pocket and walked half a block to the empty playground of the abandoned school on Conover Street. The limos streamed by, and as he watched, the backseat window slid down. Elizabeth Taylor stuck her head out into the warm, breezy sunshine. She was surprised to see him standing cocksure against the forlorn playground fence entwined with ailanthus trees, but her red lips parted in a smile. She winked, and the limo motored silently on. Orly remained long after she passed, stoop-shouldered, swooning in the sun over Elizabeth Taylor's live, half-naked breasts and the diamonds that hung from her ears and neck. Even Jack the Thief couldn't budge him. Latin music blasted from the open windows, firecrackers stuttered like machine guns, and blue sulfur rose from the street. But it was a pack of black strays, every which size, yelping and humping and nipping each other in small circular skirmishes that got Orly moving again. He passed Jewel and Thomas Delavan sitting with equally round bellies on their lawn chairs in the sidewalk in front of their Conover apartment, and he slowed to his usual going nowhere pace. If I could ride in one of them limos, Thomas, she was saying, I would die and go to heaven. Yeah, Orly taunted when he was 10 feet beyond them. Oh, shut your mouth, Jewel said, gripping the aluminum armrests. Then she turned to her husband and said, Orly, Logan makes my hair curl. But Thomas just looked the other way, toward the cops drinking lemonade at the corner. Orly was known for that kind of nasty prank. He had time to kill. He didn't want to work, and he didn't want to go to jail like Jack and the others who hung out on the street. Red Hook was everything to Orly. He generally picked on newcomers, mostly the artists who made studios and homes out of shells of buildings. He had unnerved one man by simply ripping pickets from his fence 4 and 5 times a day for a year, which the man religiously nailed back up every evening in the dark. Now the house stood empty. But Orly found that living in the Hook was trippier with the neighborhood on the upswing. Things like seeing Elizabeth Taylor affected him. Coffee Street was red, white, and blue with flags and balloons and twisted crepe paper strung from fences. Orly's neighbors had set up folding tables, barbecues, and TVs on their stoops. At the end of the street loomed Liberty herself, green, emerged from her scaffold and since last night, her torch once again burning. A vast number of white boats and ships of varying sizes bobbed at her feet in the gray-blue water. "Hey, that's not yours," said John Peach's grandson to Orly as he snitched a hot dog from their grill. He took his time smothering the bun with mustard and wiping his knife clean. Then he took a bite of half of it and, grabbing some festive napkins, wiped his mustache. Old Peach looked on from his folding chair, but the fire had gone out of him. He just smiled at Liberty's commotion, and because he had his grandkids for the weekend. "You're burnin'," said Orly to the kid. He pointed to the grill and walked off, stuffing the other half of the hot dog into his mouth. The demonstration had ended peacefully at the new chain-link fence erected to block off the old Coffee Street pier, the one slated to be rebuilt as a park. The cops were having a good time. Only locals and their relatives and those who worked in the hook clung to the fence, the result of the announcement that the pier was closed for VIPs, which had sparked the demonstration. It now ended up that everyone had a good view. Orly spotted his brother Burl walking toward him across the concrete-dusted lot. He kept on, same pace, same direction, ignoring his brother. He headed toward the weeds that grew along the far fence, away from the potted trees and giant tents that had been set up for a Chase Manhattan bank party. Burl was pinker and huskier than Orly, but both had dark hair and wore the same striped short-sleeved shirt. Burl had strong arms from working, and he none too lightly secured his younger brother's shoulder. "I saw you hanging out with the junkies on Van Brunt this morning." "Fuck off." "Don't lie, Orly. You're worse than living with Dad, drunk on his butt every night. Come on, I'll teach you the business. Spackling is easy and it's good money." Orly broke his brother's hold. He picked up a ladder hidden in the weeds, hurled it up, and jumped over to the other side. He had a plank ready, too, and laid it across the newly cut gap in the burnt pier. Burl watched his brother slip into the glare of the bright sun, and others, discovering Orly's ladder, snuck out into the closed pier after him. It was low tide by the time the sun started going down. A rainbow of pinks, comically dotted by aircraft, dominated the sky. Orly climbed the rough slab where concrete trucks were emptied and washed. He crawled behind their back ends, a dozen trucks angled in a row, and scurried past the tool shack to the top of a huge pile of warm gravel. Perched as high as the warehouse roofs, his back to the party at the concrete factory below, Orly laughed out loud. He had been fired 2 weeks ago on suspicion that he had charged 3 miter saws to the factory's account at the hardware store, but they had not been able to prove it. Yet, just this week, he made $200 hawking them door to door to carpentry shops on 5th Avenue. "Woo, woo," Orly called after smoking a joint. He cocked his ears for Jack's return hoot, but all he heard were firecrackers and echoes of tooting horns from across the harbor. Drunken tourists screamed as the stern wheeler keeled dangerously. Everyone changed sides at once, unable to take their eyes off the statue, which grew greener and brighter in the purple sky. Orly hooted again and listened hard. He heard something small and desperate beneath the dull roar. He heard something sharp and close in, a bird, he thought, but he couldn't tell from where. Seconds later, he saw a white froth beneath the pier. Without thinking, he threw his body down gravel mountain, tumbling head over heel, nearly to the water's edge. He grabbed a rope hanging inside the tool shack, surprising the lunging guard dog. Orly threw a handful of gravel in its face and slammed the door. He dropped down to the slimy green rocks and pulled himself topside of the burnt pier, nearly skipping over the burnt holes of the dock he knew so well. Halfway out, he stuck his head over the edge, searching the timbers and foul waves that slapped the creosote buildings. "Hey, hey, hey, hey," he spouted. He lit matches and dropped them into the black waves where they burnt short. The fireworks at the statue had begun. American and French flags shot up in an arc across the sky and slowly draped over the whole moaning harbor. Horns blasted in applause, and in the fading sparkle of light, Orly saw a boy swaying in the waves, holding to a spike in the piling with one hand, screaming. Orly tied a noose and lowered it, shouting to the boy to catch hold, but the waves washed it toward shore. He tried again, throwing the coiled rope against the piling until it slid into perfect position. This time the kid was able to grab hold and stuck his head and arm through. Orly winched his end around a piling in case he lost grip and began vigorously hoisting the waterlogged kid, but Orly's strength didn't last. The boy screamed as he hung there, holding onto the piling as best he could. Orly tried short jerks, raising him inch by inch, cursing with each quick breath. His beady eyes seemed to open for the first time. What was he doing? He didn't even know how to save himself. The kid was unconscious by the time he reached the deck, when Orly laid him down and got the rope off, and saw that the kid was bleeding from his head and a gash under his arm. It wasn't until he reached the fence that he called for help that Orly noticed that in the crackling light that the boy was black, a small fry, the kind he threw rocks at when 6 or 8 passed his house on Van Dyke Street to go fishing. A fleet of fire engines and ambulances were lined up waiting with drivers on Beard Street in case of emergency. Sirens flashed, separating the crowd at the pier. Orly handed the kid to the fireman, who had cut a hole in a chain-link fence. For a moment, the boy, glistening with blood and oily water in the light of the fireworks, reminded Orly of Elizabeth Taylor's diamonds. Orly panicked. He ducked out of sight before the kid was placed on a stretcher and wove his way back to the beach. Crouched in semi-darkness, he smoked down another joint. "Hey man," Jack said an hour later on Van Dyke Street. His feet bounced as if they were walking on foam cushion. "I heard you've been doing charity at the pier." "Fuck off," Orly said. "A judge hears you saved a kid and he'll take a couple years off a sentence." Blasted by the scratchy Star-Spangled Banner, Orly pushed through the wrought iron gate past his mother and father on the front patio watching TV. To him, they looked like dummies propped in plastic chairs holding plastic cups. He nabbed his 6-pack from their cooler and, ignoring his father's heckle, disappeared into the cool, dark, empty house. So back to the neighborhood, the Civic Association meetings were always packed and often ended in shouting matches. Mayor Ed Koch promised to renovate the burnt Coffee Street Pier, but year after year it never happened. Then one day a putrid garbage transfer station opened on our block. We could no longer hang laundry or garden or have candlelight dinners in our backyard. Kids at PS 15 couldn't play in the schoolyard. Boys shot rats in the street with BB guns. A protest was organized. Everyone joined in. Teachers, families, old-timers, the bodega owner, the Protestant minister from around the corner, the beloved PS 15 principal, Mr. Daly. Perfume was sprayed to cover up the stench, and the transfer station didn't close down for a few more years. Paul and I bought a little fishing cabin in the Catskills as a weekend escape. I'm going to end with the biggest love story, my biggest love story in Red Hook. Mercedes Solis, want to wave your hand? As a spunky 8-year-old flirt, she and her family moved into the 3rd floor apartment next door to us in 1982. She asked me a million questions about my mundane chores, like pulling weeds in the sidewalk or chipping century-old paint from our wrought iron fence, or about our dog she called Jingles. I used to tease her mother and tell her that I wanted to adopt her daughter. When Mercedes was 12, I hired her to babysit while I wrote upstairs. She played with blocks and Legos. with the boys and read stories aloud and listened to old sea shanties on the record player. And she made a surprise party for our son's first birthday on the back patio with a cake from College Bakery on Court Street. But not long after, Mercedes was diagnosed with lupus, and soon her family moved to the Red Hook housing projects 3 avenues away. And within a year, Mercedes' mother died, and Mercedes' sister, almost 18 years old, became the head of the family. Mercedes was 14 and her little brother 9. Her sister took a job at the dress shop in Park Slope, and they managed with the help of a grandmother, aunts, and cousins who, by the way, threw Mercedes a beautiful Sweet 16. Her grandmother sewed all the dresses. Mercedes was on home instruction, too ill to take a school bus or a bus to Manhattan, to her Manhattan high school. She stopped by to see us when she could. She didn't have a phone, and she occasionally still babysat. When Mercedes turned 18, she introduced us to her boyfriend, a shy, handsome, 6'5", 18-year-old who was raised by his grandparents in the projects. Want to raise your hand? By then, we were living on the Upper West Side, and I had invited them for dinner. Afterwards, they built a Lego city with the boys. They graduated from high school, and I was proud. They eventually moved to Connecticut, and at 21, she called to tell me she was pregnant. When I visited her baby son, she was on dialysis 3 times a week because of kidney failure. I gave her a notebook, the only medicine I knew, and suggested she start writing a memoir. She said, "I can't stand not having a mother any longer. It hurts too much. Can I call you Mom?" Ever since, I've been Ma, Mommy Mo, or Mom, depending on her mood. After 2 years, she received a kidney transplant from a cousin related on both sides of her family. And today, at 47, she's still writing. At 26, her son is as handsome as her husband. And in 2020, her memoir about growing up in Red Hook was a finalist in the Brooklyn Film Festival nonfiction contest. That's my daughter. Thank you.